Today is August 6th, 2026, and welcome to another edition of the Will Work for Food seminar series, part of the New Possibilities Hour. Every week, our team, Natalie Armstrong-Matan, Felicia Harris-Haas, Jeff Kitchhaven, Jean Lawler, Kimberly Best, and myself, bring you a fantastic speaker to address our audience of mediators, arbitrators, lawyers, and anyone else who negotiates or deals with conflict resolution. As you know, there's no charge for these fantastic programs. Instead, if you like what you see, we ask you to consider donating to a local food bank, directly to that food bank to help us fight hunger. One of our favorite parts of the program every week is when we report just how generous our amazing audiences have been, and we reveal the running tally of what's been raised from our program so far. So, Kim, I think you are the one doing the honors for us today.
I do have the honor of this one, and thank you all for your generosity and our speakers like Tracey for making this possible. Due to the combined effort in caring, we have today $1,018,000, $18,733.76. So thank you all very much.
It's really fantastic. Every dollar translates into multiple meals. We just ask you to please let us know about the donations that you've made. You can put that information in the chat. You can always email us directly through our website as well, and we're more than happy to keep track of those donations. Um, I'm now delighted to introduce today's program and speaker. We have an excellent topic and an outstanding speaker for you today. Today we have Tracey Frisch of the American Arbitration Institute Association, who will be speaking on advancing mediation through innovation. Tracey's going to be talking about some new tools that AAA offers, some work that's done through the ICDR Foundation, and some additional topics of interest to our folks. By way of background, Tracey is the Division Vice President of Mediation at the American Arbitration Association International Center for Dispute Resolution, where she leads the association's mediation business. She previously served as the association's Associate General Counsel and as an adjunct professor at Pace University Law School, teaching commercial arbitration law, and then teaching at Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law as well, where she supervised law student mediators. Tracey is a member of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York Pro Bono Mediation Panel, specializing in employment discrimination cases. She's a member of the New York County Lawyer Association Part 137 Attorney-Client Fee Dispute Pro Bono Mediation Panel, and is a New York State Certified Community Mediator. Tracey has mediated many cases at many of Metropolitan New York's community mediation centers and in small claims and civil courts. She's authored and spoken on numerous ADR-focused topics. She earned her law degree cum laude from Benjamin Cardozo School of Law and her BA magna cum laude from Tulane University. Many of us in this seminar today also know Tracey more personally through their own relationship with the AAA, and they will attest, I am sure, to the fact that she's truly an outstanding advocate, not only for mediation, but for our broader community of mediators themselves. She's a resource. She's a presence on panels and at ADR conferences throughout the country, and indeed an advocate for us on a global stage through the AAA's international reach. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce you today, Tracey. Thank you so much for being here. I thought maybe you could start out by telling us a little bit about the Dobbs Ferry Food Pantry, the food bank that you've identified for today, and then maybe we could chat a little bit and get into your program.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for joining for this hour. It's really a pleasure to be part of this community and to be here with you all today. So I live in a town north of New York City, Dobbs Ferry in Westchester County, and we have a local community food bank, the Dobbs Ferry Food Pantry. And every Wednesday they open their doors to whoever shows up. I pass it on the way to work on Wednesday mornings on the way to the train. And it's just a real community resource. Folks, they serve about 100 families every week, and during COVID, that more than doubled. So it really was something that really got, I think, a lot of folks through the pandemic in a very real way. So if you are so inclined, check out the Dobbs Ferry Food Pantry. It's super local. It's all volunteer run. And, I see it in action, like I said, every week. So I feel very comfortable asking you all to donate to it. And my husband and I, we have a regular ongoing monthly donation to the food pantry ourselves.
Sounds like a fantastic organization. The information about them is going to be in the chat so folks can donate directly during the seminar. And talking about the service that they offered to the community during COVID really is perfect for this seminar series because as many folks know, it was started by Natalie during COVID as a way to build community and bring folks together and also support all those people who were waiting online at food banks that were overwhelmed as well. So really fantastic tie-in to the motivating energy behind this program. So Tracey, you've got a really interesting background in terms of how you came to mediation. I know you made your bones in the New York City legal community as a mediator and going to school there, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you came to mediation and maybe when the light clicked for you that this was something that you were really going to focus on professionally.
Yeah, thank you. So I was a peer mediator in high school. I sort of was just tapped to join the peer mediation team, and I really enjoyed it. I was like, oh, people are having conflict. Let me get in the middle of it. And I just sort of loved being in that position and helping out sort of my friends and schoolmates. And then I went to Tulane University, as you said, and I saw a sign that said they were looking for someone to develop a logo for the Tulane mediation team. So I called the number on the sign and I said, I'm not a visual artist, but I'm a mediator. And I go, who are you? I was like, I'm a freshman, Newcomb College. And then, well, our mediation team is made up of, administrators. And I said, well, who are you mediating? And they said, well, we're mediating students disputes. We're mediating disputes between students and faculty. I said, well, don't you think they'd rather have another student, being in the room with them than like the vice dean of punishment, who they literally had like running the program at the time. And they're like, oh, that's an interesting concept. So they let me join the mediation team, and I got trained by the School of Social Work in the law school. And one of the trainers from the School of Social Work kind of took me under her wing, and we went out into the New Orleans community and taught conflict resolution and peer mediation in public schools in New Orleans. And I just loved that, having come from that space myself, then to be able to, train other young people in conflict resolution. And then I moved to New York and worked for a nonprofit teaching conflict resolution and peer mediation in public schools in New York and the 5 boroughs. That was, an amazing experience. And we would go into schools, and it wasn't just sort of me going in. We actually had young people that came through the program. We paid them stipends to come and do the trainings with us. So it was a much more legitimate to have students from the area coming in and saying to the students, hey, yeah, this is real, give this, some attention. And it was just a wonderful experience to then again see through like young people's eyes, learning about these skills and using these skills, and then sort of seeing the students who had come up through the program continue on, and many of them are doing things in the field today as well. And then I decided that people doing interesting things in this area, a lot of them had law degrees, so maybe I should get a law degree. So went to Cardozo Law School, which has a great program in mediation and conflict resolution, and liked law school more than I thought I would. So I ended up going to a big firm in New York and practicing law as a litigation associate. I learned a lot about a lot, but I also learned that probably wasn't the route I wanted to take for my life path. So I ended up meeting the then general counsel of the AAA, Eric Tuchman, through a experience I had in law school working on the model standards of conduct when they were being revised in 2005. So that's come full circle because I'm now part of a group that's looking at them again. Did an informational interview with Eric, and he said there was an opening in the law department of the AAA. So I just thought perfect, married my interest in law with my passion for ADR. So I was in-house counsel at the AAA for 16 years. So I've been at the AAA for quite a while. And then at the beginning of 2025, I was asked if I would take this position to lead our mediation work at the AAA. And I thought, yes, absolutely. I would love to and sort of get back to my roots in the mediation world. So I'm very pleased to be here and sort of doing everything mediation here at the AAA. So it's fun. It's my favorite topic. So other than
That's
the foundation, which I'm going to be talking about too.
Well, we would definitely want to hear about that. I mean, it's such a fantastic story, and it really is sort of, to use your words, you've kind of come full circle back to where you started with mediation, to be able to have that perspective of having done the peer-based mediation and the community-based mediation, then working in the commercial litigation environment in New York, of all places, and actually working in-house for the AAA. I think many folks don't necessarily appreciate not only the scope of what the AAA deals with, but the really thorny legal issues that come up that the arbitrators come up against, I should say, during these cases, and the resource that you provide to arbitrators and mediators about how do we deal with this potential conflict issue or these various issues that you're
Yeah,
dealing with.
I
So
say we're like the ER of ADR, and is
that's a great term.
right.
It's great. Um, and obviously what it does is it gives you so much credibility and ability to relate to the community. So thank you so much for what you do for us at the AAA and beyond. And maybe with that we can get into your program. I know there are some new innovations at the AAA and some tools that you wanted to tell the audience about today. And I think that you had mentioned that you were sort of, very open to having a dialogue with our audience. And if folks have questions, they should feel free to put them in the chat, raise their hand, and have a conversation with you about it, I'm sure. And
Yes.
maybe with that, we can get on with your program.
Yes, great. Thank you. Um, so as you all have probably seen, the AAA has been highly innovative, in our past few years here, building out all sorts of tools, incorporating AI in different ways. And one place that we had already tackled was dusting off those clauses, right? People have sort of the same ADR clauses in their contracts. They cut and paste. I can tell you as from when my time as a litigation associate, right? You'd kind of go into the shared documents on the server and sort of find a clause and sort of cut and paste that into, the next thing you were working on. And you don't think sort of a lot about it. So the AAA had already come out with Clause Builder, and then we built that into Clause Builder AI. And I was thinking about that, and I was like, okay, that's great, for pre-dispute agreements to mediate and to arbitrate. But what else, where else could that really be useful? And so I was thinking about those agreements to mediate, right, that people use at the start of a mediation session. I'd love to hear in the comments too. I know some people don't use them, then I get that. But I'd love to sort of get a sense of folks, if you use agreements to mediate when you enter into a mediation with parties, and how often do you look at that? How often do you dust that off and sort of take a fresh look at what those provisions say, and think about, okay, has practice advanced in some way that I might want to update those agreements. So one thing I had worked on with our group here at the AAA, our development group, is can we create a tool that would help mediators and help parties think about these agreements, which often go sort of untouched sort of year after year. So I'm going to share my screen. I'll do a little presentation, but as David said, please feel free to raise your hand and put in the chat. And David, just let me know, because when I share my screen, I may not be able to see everything so well. So feel free to interrupt me. But I'm going
I will
to.
keep an eye on things for you.
Okay, thank you. I'll share this. And then I will get it in presentation mode. Okay, you can see that?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, so thinking about effective agreements to mediate. So why do you use them? Here's reasons I think you use them. You may have other reasons, and feel free to throw in the chat why you use them or don't use them. I think it's always interesting to have sort of a conversation about, like maybe they don't matter. I don't know. But here's some reasons I think why mediators tend to use agreements to mediate. And here's some, again, just sort of my thoughts on what are some core provisions that go into these agreements to mediate. Coming from the legal department, yeah, exclusion of liability. Not everyone may agree with that. From my experience, I like sort of to have that in these agreements. And then thinking about what do you put in? So what do you say, about, a mediator's role? What are the elements that you put in there? And I'd love to hear, from anyone, if you throw in the chat or raise your hand, what are some things you might want to say about a mediator's role in your agreement to mediate? What do you want the parties to know?
I mean, I think the primary one most of us think about is that we're here to be neutral. We're not here to offer advice. I know folks think about the new ethics opinions that have come out in that regard and making sure they don't run afoul of those obligations.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, it's like no authority to make a binding decision, right? It's the parties' decisions. Right, that's great. Mediator responsible for process, clients responsible for outcome, right? You want to sort of set the stage of like, I am not, I'm not here to be the judge. I'm not here to be, the decision maker. And then, do you put something in there about it's a voluntary, and do you say anything about a good faith process, and question to you all sort of what types of things do you think go into this provision, or do you shy away from this provision? Yeah, I think confidentiality, I agree. We'll get to that one. Yeah. So you might say, something about attendance at the sessions, being prepared to discuss the issues, authority, right? Do the people there have the authority to settle, or they have access to someone with the authority to settle? You might say something about being able to withdraw. There's a number of things, you might want to say to the parties so they understand that this is, voluntary process, and sort of defining what you mean, right, by good faith, because I think people could have different interpretations about what that means. Big one that was already come up in the chat, confidentiality, right? This can be, authority issue. Obviously, you want to take a look at the jurisdiction where you are. It's not the same everywhere. I know a bunch of you are here from California, which is different provisions than you're going to get in somewhere like where I am in New York. And I'd be interested again, in the chat, sort of what do you say about confidentiality? What are some key things that you want to make sure that the parties are aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that comes up in California is, how long are we going to keep the mediation open after it concludes at the end of the day, and how does that affect potential confidentiality considerations and the communications between the mediator and the lawyers as well?
Yeah. When does the mediation end? What about sort of, you go through some sessions and then you have post mediation work or emails or something, and how do you define all that?
Tracey, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about sort of the something that I think feeds into all these different topics that you're going through, which is there's kind of an overarching, I think, consideration when you look at these agreements, where you really, I think it's important to think about how to tailor them to your practice and who your audience in terms of who you're mediating with. And maybe more sophisticated parties, don't need as much about the role of the mediator, and may respond to the pre-mediation waivers in a different way than other parties, and versus in a peer mediation context, for example, as well. And I think people think about, folks don't want to read agreements that are long, right? And then I think folks who are getting started out sometimes feel a tension in getting the agreement signed and it being an obstacle to actually moving forward with the mediation. And then what happens if you get to the day of the mediation and not everybody has signed the agreement? Do you go through this process? And I know there are new tools that are available to get these agreements signed along the way with some of these online booking systems and things like that. But how do you advise folks when it comes to thinking about how to navigate those tensions in their own practice?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with sort of your own comfort level, right? Do you know these parties, right? Have you had experience with them? How sophisticated are they? Absolutely. Have they been through the mediation process, a million times, and repeat players, and you're sort of not concerned? Or is there someone part of the process who's new? I mean, like, and not just the counsel, but the parties. I think you want to make sure that the parties are understanding all of this. Are you comfortable with it not being signed if you have a conversation, right, with the parties directly, with their counsel about, these things, and okay, we're not going to sign it? I think it absolutely is just a matter of your own comfort level. What I hate to see happen is have mediators who just sort of let these agreements sit, and they're just the boilerplate, agreement, and you're just not revisiting it. And I'm going to get to some sort of like, what are things maybe we're not thinking about, right? In this context, that maybe are newer and you need to be thinking about. So, I think it's not just about a check the box exercise. It's the same thing with the clause, that maybe you're cutting and pasting into contracts as a transactional lawyer. It's about thinking about the parties that are appearing in front of you, the case that's at hand, and your own practice. Absolutely. So that's right. The whole idea behind it is that this is not sort of like a one size fits all type of exercise. So I'll just go through quickly. So some other things that you see in these generally are conflict of interest, disclosures. I do think this is important, right, to have in writing, in terms of what the expectations are here, and to have it not just be sort of the mediator who's making this reasonable effort to learn about potential conflicts and make disclosures, but the parties and their representatives too, should be talking about what do they know, as sort of as potential disclosures. And again, like you were saying, David, this all goes along with like, who are these folks? Are they folks that have appeared before you before and everyone kind of knows each other and it's, it's sort of that, or is it people, you don't know, and so there might be more of a heightened level of disclosure, depending on the context. This is a big one, and I know there's been a lot of discussion around this. You mentioned the ethics opinion, ABA 518 too, like no legal advice. Again, pro se parties, self-represented parties, California, I think you said pro per parties, what's their level of knowledge, making sure, and it's not obviously enough, and I think that's what the opinion 518 is telling us, to just have it in your agreement to mediate, right? It's also something that has to be discussed again and again as you're talking about, potential settlement, things like that, to remind a self-represented party that, you're not their lawyer, you don't have their best interest in mind, you're not there to give them legal advice. But, I do think it's important, particularly if it's parties that, you're not familiar with, maybe aren't as sophisticated, that you're not functioning as an attorney, regardless of whether you are actually an attorney, because I know that can be very confusing for parties in mediation. And then this one, maybe is a little controversial in terms of exclusion of liability. Again, from my perspective, coming from the AAA's legal department, I like this kind of provision in an agreement to mediate. The AAA does provide in our mediation procedures a provision about exclusion of liability for the mediator for an error, an act, or omission in connection with the mediation, and also protection, not just that, but being not called as a witness, not subpoenaed. You can put something in that if you do that, you have to pay for attorney's fees, costs, mediator time. We don't all practice in California and have as strong provisions in the law that protect mediators from being called as witnesses. So, you just really want to know sort of with the jurisdiction where you're practicing, what the protections are, and then, I think put those into an agreement to mediate. And again, happy to take comments or in the chat about sort of thoughts on this, because I know there's not sort of agreement in this area.
Well, Tracey, I'll jump in for a second.
Sure.
Without stepping on the landmine of whether or not it should be in there or not, I would say, can you give us a sense? I think many mediators often think, well, what am I going to get sued for? I'm neutral. Can't force them to do anything. There's confidentiality. In your experience working for the AAA, what are some of the different ways this goes sideways? Because you can say to yourself, well, I don't need an agreement. What am I going to get sued for? And then when folks do go sideways on you, I think the first thing you say is, I wish I had a signed agreement that addressed it.
Yeah. So I think mainly with mediation, what you see more is the subpoena and the being called as a witness, when there's an issue as to what did we mean, what did we mean when we wrote this in our settlement agreement? and there's disagreement from the parties on that, or someone is trying to get out of the settlement agreement, so sort of buyer's remorse in some way, or saying, there was something that happened in the mediation session that should excuse them from having to be forced to keep this settlement agreement. So I think a lot of times it is looking, in the mediation context, it's looking more for testimony from the mediator. And I have seen that. I mean, it's not, terribly common, but it does happen.
So, Tracy, if a lawyer were to put something like that into a engagement agreement with a client, in California, it would be the basis for discipline. You're strictly forbidden from doing it. Under the ABA model rules, you can do it, but only with the giving the client the prior opportunity to get advice from independent counsel. So I don't use mediation confidentiality agreements at all. And this is one of the main reasons why. I don't think I'm above the law. I think I'm part of the American economy. And just like pharmaceutical manufacturers, drug companies, auto manufacturers, and everybody else, if I do something that doesn't live up to the standard of care and causes somebody actual harm, I actually want them to be compensated for it. I don't want to be above the law. I have a malpractice policy which stands behind me. So really the only people financially who benefit from this are the insurance companies who give us our malpractice policies and to whom we have already paid premiums. So I would respectfully differ with you here. I do not believe it's appropriate for us, most of us are lawyers, to say that when we function as mediators, we function under a lesser ethical standard than the standard under which we function when we actually practice law. Where, as Max Factor once said, mediators are not a protected class. We're not an endangered species. We have no right to say that we're above the law. So I feel I must make that clear.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that about you, Jeff, too. So I was waiting for you to chime in in on that issue. So yeah, no, I totally respect your view on this. You want to sort of stand behind your practice and what you do. I can tell you from, my experience in the AAA's legal department that courts have upheld these provisions in the AAA rules when it comes to arbitration and to mediation. But yeah, it's absolutely a personal preference, whether this is something, you want to include or not. I'm curious too, like, what do you think about the part not being called as a witness or subpoenaed, to get embroiled in the parties' post-settlement dispute?
I think if you have you remember, evidence doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the state. And the general rule of evidence is that all relevant evidence is admissible. And we want all relevant evidence to be admissible because that is how we ensure that the justice system comes up with just results, because they have all the relevant evidence before it. That in turn is important to maintaining and establishing the primacy of the rule of law, confidence that courts are going to get things right. So again, when mediators want to place themselves above the law and say, oh, well, everybody else is subject to a subpoena, but not we mediators, what you're basically doing is undermining confidence in the administration of justice. And again, what in the world makes us so special that everybody else in American society has to give relevant testimony if they have relevant evidence, but not mediators? I think it's arrogant.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. I think that when we've seen sort of both parties wanting mediators to get involved, then I think that's different than sort of when one side wants it, one side doesn't, and there's sort of arguments about that. I think it makes it a little bit more of a thorny issue. But I think when both sides are like, no, we really need to understand X, Y, Z. I think I see it differently than when the parties are at odds in terms of whether they want the mediator to get involved in sort of post dispute issues. Yeah, Jean.
This is a hot topic, and I totally understand where Jeff's coming from and agree in principle with him. But the letter of the law in California, the evidence codes specifically provide, in some respects, on that to the contrary. And there's a form. I just want to point this out so it's clear on the record. There is a form, ADR 200, that is a form approved for use by the Judicial Council of California in 2020. And it specifically asks the lawyers to have their clients sign it, because the lawyers have to explain to their clients mediation before going in. And I pulled the form up to actually look at it again and see what it says, but it specifically says, it goes through the statutory, codes, and says, in general, these laws mean the following. And one of the 4 bullet points is a mediator cannot testify in any subsequent civil proceeding about any communication or conduct occurring at or in connection with a mediation. So, what actually would happen, who knows? But there is law and a form the council presumably get their clients to sign that specifically say that in California.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, and I think it could use a full hour or more on its own, and thinking about what does it do to the mediation process to then sort of think, oh, it's possible that this mediator might be testifying, about what they heard during the mediation. But I love the discussion. So, all right, I'll just move a little quickly because I don't have time to talk about the foundation too. So, obviously mediation fees and deposits. I don't think this one's controversial. I think you want, to get paid. So I encourage, to put into the, agreement about what your rate is going to be, whose obligation is it to pay, what kind of advance deposit you need, and all that sort of housekeeping stuff. So there are some additional clauses. I'm sort of getting to what we've created here at the AAA. So there's some additional clauses to think about here. And here is just some, I'm sure there's more than this, but, just thinking about what else might you want to put in. I appreciate the comment, David. How long do you want this to be? Yeah, I mean, you don't want this to be like a 10-page document that turns anybody off. Nobody wants to see that. So, keeping that in mind too, sort of what's actually important. And something that, I think we should all be thinking about is use of AI in mediation, right? Thinking about, does this have a place, in the agreement to mediate? Does it go in the agreement to mediate? Is a conversation that you have, with the parties, about how they plan to use AI. There's been cases that have come out. I know there's been a lot of discussion around them, so I won't go into them too much. But there's been cases in 2026 that sort of talk about whether using an AI platform waives attorney-client privilege. Does it waive, protections for these communications? And does it waive work product doctrine? And your cases have gone both ways. So, thinking about how does that affect the mediation process? If you're putting sort of things that are said or done in mediation into, an open source AI, is there some argument there that you're waiving some kind of mediation confidentiality? I think we're going to see this playing out in practice, and I think we're going to see it playing out in the courts when it comes to mediation. So, just thinking about what are we talking to our clients about? Our use of AI as mediators and the parties' use of AI before and during the mediation session. So I don't know if there's other comments on this one. Oops. Okay. So what we let's see, I see there's a new comment here. So what we have done at the AAA is create, I think, a pretty cool tool, and it's an agreement to mediate builder. So it does embed an LLM and AI in the background to help, but it is also based on, we reviewed about 50 agreements of AAA mediators in building this. So it's based on real practice. And then it has some options to create a general provision that has just a few, I think, sort of core provisions there, and you can always edit and play around with it. And then it gives suggestions, like, do you want to also add this? Do you want to also add that? So it's an interesting tool. It's free to anyone to use. Here's the website, agreementtomediatebuilder.adr.org, if you want to sort of play around with it. And again, it's just really meant as a starting off point, just to think about dusting these, to the extent you use them, to think about dusting off these agreements to mediate and think about, what else might you want to include? How might you want to change those agreements? But I want to have time to talk about my other favorite topic, which is, here's just some links for AAA mediation, the Agreement to Mediate Builder, and for those of you who don't know, we've created a mediation magazine, which some of you have published in, so thank you. And Jeff, I would welcome an article on the exclusion of liability. I think that's such a great topic. So, anything that folks are sort of thinking about, we'd love to sort of publish your thoughts on what's news in mediation and what's sort of the big practice issues of today. And my other role at the AAA, beyond running our mediation business, is I'm also the executive director of our foundation, which we've had since 2015. And our newest focus area is advancing mediation and conflict resolution by integrating them into alternative crisis response initiatives. And so I'd love just to spend, my last minutes with you, I guess we're sort of halfway through here, on talking about that topic, because I think it's a very interesting topic and one that folks may not have thought about before. So what does this mean? When you call 911, what are you provided the options for, right? Do you want police, EMS, fire, right? Those are sort of the things that you get. And from what I've learned of looking into this area over the past few years is that people call 911 for a million different reasons. Like 911 is like a catch-all number that people call, yes, when there's sort of a violent crime, yes, when there's, fire and emergency. They also call when there's mental health issues, behavioral health issues, interpersonal conflict issues. My kid won't go to school. What do I do? My neighbor's playing their music too loud. I need a police officer to come, and have them turn the music down. And one thing that the foundation has been looking at is how can mediation play a role in this system? So what a lot of communities have started doing is implementing alternative response. So you call 911, maybe you have a mental health professional go out if it's a mental health call. Maybe you have a social worker go out if it's, someone who's just causing a disturbance. But in Dayton, Ohio, they have mediators go out. So they have a mediation response unit that is made up, it comes out of the Dayton Community Mediation Center, but these mediators are trained in what I would call field mediation, because it's very different to like go out on a 911 call than it is to be sitting at a community mediation center and, parties are walking in and sitting down at the table and ready to mediate. And they are hooked in with the 911 dispatch. And when a call comes in, they can self-dispatch themselves. So if a call comes in and it's a neighbor dispute and it's low level, there's no gun present, there's no sort of mention of any kind of violence happening on the scene, then someone from the mediation response unit will take that call, they'll code it for themselves. Okay, this is going to be us who responds. And they call ahead to the caller and say, hey, we're not police. We're not going to come and, arrest anybody, but we want to come help you resolve this conflict. And they show up. They have a van that says mediation. They have these maroon shirts that say mediator, and they come on the scene and they field mediate, right? They say what's going on and they try and help the parties, resolve whatever the conflict is that they're experiencing that they called 911 for. They can offer wraparound services, like if you need emergency food help, or they're sort of understanding like the underlying issues, right, of what's happening in this dispute, and it's like a lack of service issue. They have access to that, and then they can also refer the parties to the center, for after you've cooled down or when you're ready, like let's come in and talk, if it's sort of not going to happen on the scene. So what we've been looking at, what the AAA-ICDR Foundation has been looking at, is what are other municipalities who might be ready to implement something similar. So we've seen the proof of concept in Dayton. They've been doing this since 2022. They have a ton. They actually keep great statistics on their website. You can see on their dashboard how many calls they've responded to. That less than 5% have they needed to actually get backup for themselves. They're on the police radio, so they can get backup right away if something were to go sideways. And then how many have been sort of repeat callers. And what you see is that people who have called and called and called, 911 again and again and again, that drops way down. And this program in Dayton has the support of the chief of police and of dispatch. So what they've found is that their police officers have more time to respond to the calls that they are needed for, rather than the calls that unfortunately they have to deprioritize because they don't, they can't get to everything. There's only so much time in the day. So having these mediators go out and respond to a number of these calls that would otherwise need police response, has really helped the police department in freeing their officers up for the calls where they're needed. So yeah, it's a really cool program. But someone asked, what's the website address? You want to know the website address for Dayton's program? I can pull that up. Yeah. So I'd love to, reactions, thoughts, questions. I think to me, this is like a huge innovation, for where mediation can really play a role in public safety, and sort of change the way we think about public safety and sort of community response. But I'd love to hear sort of thoughts and reactions.
Tracey, I'll jump in. I mean, it's an incredible program, and it makes me think of two things that we talk about in the context of mediation all the time, which is, when the police come out, they only have sort of certain tools that are available to them. It's almost sort of like, you go in front of a judge, right? And there's only certain things that you can get from a judge.
Mm-hmm.
Within the context of mediation, there's a lot more that can be worked out between the parties in that context, I think, right? So it's fantastic to have that as a resource. And to your point about, the repeat callers calling less, it's got to be such an inflammatory type of experience when the police come out and you have to deal with them. So I imagine it really helps with de-escalation of these disputes as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, and it's, I'm just putting the website in for the MRU, and you can see the dashboard there and everything. Yeah. And it's interesting because, it really takes, it takes obviously the buy-in from police, right? They need to feel, and the buy-in from dispatch. What we've actually found is like the 911, the dispatch centers are one of the key areas because they feel very responsible. You're getting a call, someone's calling because it's in their mind, an emergency. And do you feel comfortable sending out a non-law enforcement response to that call? People who are not armed, people who are not, do you feel okay about that? So I think a lot of what we found where the work really needs to be done is sort of like that trust, that not every call needs a law enforcement response, and that it's okay, but you have to know, like, well, what are the calls that are appropriate, right? So how do you code the calls? So it's been a lot of interesting work to speak with sort of the dispatch side as well as the law enforcement side of this. But in, I think it was Columbus, Ohio, they just passed a referendum, and I think it passed by over 70%, to change their city charter to include alternative response as part of what they want sort of their 911 system to include. So you do see sort of communities and wanting this. And it seems like something that sort of goes across political divides, which is crazy to say these days, but it does seem like that, let's free up our law enforcement for the calls that they are needed on. And let's think about, for all of these 911 calls, who else might be best, to respond. I did a podcast we'll put out for the foundation yesterday with Max Markham, who runs the NYU policing project, and they've been very involved in this work. And the foundation attended convening in Chicago at the beginning of June on alternative response, and the theme was creating permanency. Because the idea, like, we're called alternative dispute resolution. Well, why should we be all the alternative, right? I think they feel the same way about alternative response. Why should this be the alternative? It should just be, we're all first responders, that these sort of mediators who are responding to 911 calls should be treated the same, get pensions, get overtime, be part of city budgets, like sort of the same respect, as the other first responders, because they're just as needed and just as important.
So I've got, I guess, maybe a three-part question for you. Okay, so and forgive me if you address some of this.
Yeah.
But what are the resources that the AAA is already deploying in these different jurisdictions or has available to try and help these programs? If you're a mediator yourself in one of these places, or it's just anywhere, I imagine, and you want to help, and what can folks do? And I guess the third question is, you're running this foundation and you're involved in this program. What is your vision for what you think that it could be 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What would you love to see happen that you folks could accomplish with the support of the community?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in terms of individual, it's asking your own, I live in a small community. I know the chief of police here in my town, like, hey, this seems cool. Like, would you ever consider something like this? Like, have you thought about this? Is this something that would be helpful? Sort of just, being an advocate for the idea, right, of alternative response, I think is always, helpful, sort of whether you're a mediator or not. But you can, as a mediator, you can explain much better what you mean, in terms of what that would look like. And I think, in terms of where I want to be, I agree. When I said I was talking to Max from the NYU Policing Project yesterday, and I asked him the same question. And his response, I agree with his response, which is this idea of being part of the first response. That being into city budgets. Because the hardest thing is, foundation is seed money, right? That's what we provide. We help with the proof of concept, with you need data to show, right, the lawmakers that this is worthwhile for your budget, like this helps reduce cost, and it's safe, it works, it's something the community wants. So you need data. So you need sort of the proof of concept, you need data, and that's where we help, but we can't sustain a program like that. We can help sort of launch it, get it started, but then once you have that proof of concept, you need sort of the government entity to take it into a budget, right? It has to become part of the budget line. The same way that fire, emergency services, law enforcement are part of the budget lines. So I think that's where I hope to see it, in 5-10 years, that they're part of, it's sort of a regular thing, that they're part of municipal budgets, and that it's something that is not seen as alternative. Maybe it'll take longer than 5 years, but something that is seen as, I'm going to call 911, or I'm going to call 311, or in some states it's 211. And I know that I can say, this is the situation. I don't think I need a officer, but I need someone just to help me figure this out. Yeah. But yeah, I encourage you to check out Dayton. And right now we've been talking to a lot of different organizations, because we're thinking about where we're going to put sort of our next big chunk of funding. And so we've been talking to municipalities who already have alternative response programs and want to add mediation into it. So we're thinking about, so you have alternative responders already, backgrounds in social work, backgrounds in psychology. Does it make sense to train them, in mediation and have them be able to do this work? or do you do what Dayton's done and sort of work with a community mediation center or folks who are already sort of mediators and teach them how to be not first responders, but doing this kind of response, like field mediation. So those are some things that we're thinking about. And a lot of these places, you need like technical assistance. So there's organizations out there where this is what they do. They work with municipalities to talk to stakeholders, really get like sort of the feasibility study done. Do we have the buy-in? Do we have the ability? Would this be self-sustaining if we were able to prove the proof of concept here? Do we have the police buy-in? Do we have the dispatch buy-in? And these organizations help sort of understand how that all works together, because as you can imagine, sort of, you might be a mayor or something, and you're like, well, where do I start, right? So you need, I think, that sort of expertise and technical assistance to see whether you can lay the groundwork to have this type of program in your jurisdiction. So those are other things that we're looking at. And we're also looking at the 911 dispatch. I think that's a huge part of it. Like studying that, like what are the calls that should be coded, to go for this kind of this kind of service. So there's a lot of building blocks to making this happen. But it's been so amazing to see the Dayton program, and the Dayton program came to us. We had like an open invite for proposals, and we got this one, and we were like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then it sort of helped them grow through the next subsequent years, and then decided like, okay, this is where we want to focus. This is where we think we can have the greatest impact is this area of mediation.
I mean, it just offers tremendous hope for what's possible. To me, it seems like a really sort of an exciting extension of the conversation and dialogue around mediation more generally. I remember, I remember when I was a young associate coming out of law school and hearing about this guy named Jeff Kitchaven, who had started a mediation practice. And there was this sort of dialogue at the time, well, what is mediation? And you can be a full-time mediator and you can do this sort of thing, and sort of, trailblazers in the community who have really raised awareness around mediation, and even within the court system, right? There's such a shift in different jurisdictions, and for folks who have friends internationally in different communities around the world, you see this adoption of mediation. It seems like such just a natural extension of that conversation in a way that can have a big impact.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there have been programs, and I'm just putting the foundation's website in the chat too. There have been programs for a long time in communities of violence intervention programs. So these are folks who are, from the community. Many of them were involved in violence themselves, sort of came out the other side and were like, I want to help, solve conflicts in my community and not be sort of part of the system of violence. And we've worked with this organization called Cure Violence Global that really sees this as a health issue, sort of like when you think about COVID, so someone is not feeling well, and then how does it spread? How does it spread? And so they use this violence interventionist there might be like a shooting and someone's in the hospital, and they go and they're like, okay, let's quash this. Like, let's not have this sustained cycle of violence, from what happened. So, what they're doing is mediating. And so it's like, this is already happening a lot in communities. I think it just hasn't been sort of seen as like a profession, and so I think it's like sort of part of it is also like recognizing that this work is important and can help sort of the broader community as well. And so I think that's part of sort of what we're thinking about and looking at too.
Tracey, can I put in the link? It's interesting because outside of attorney mediation, there's an army of people doing this work in community on the ground, like NAFCM, and DG Mon is going to be a guest speaker coming up. And the community centers are doing this kind of stuff just everywhere, even though the response unit, the first to do it was indeed Dayton. So do you mind if I put in NAFCM's community mediation link
Please.
in the
No,
chat
we're good friends with DG, and absolutely.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
That's how I met you, through them.
Yeah.
So just the scope of this is not new.
Right,
right?
exactly. It's just sort
And
of
they're like,
combining all the dots, or whatever,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tracey, I just wanted to say thank you. You're doing a wonderful job of bringing some nice information together. And I just wanted to add also that in Houston, they have the police department has their own dedicated program with their own mediators. I was part of the first group 15 years ago till they couldn't get my fingerprints anymore. When you get old, you lose your fingerprints, and I wasn't going to go to 4 places to have handprints done.
Yeah.
But I think I'm going to bring this back to them because I think the program for the community outreach is a very interesting concept as long as people are paid. And I always get nervous when people say, oh, there's a great program. Let's find volunteers. And, you know, anybody can pray, but there are ministers that work with God and they get paid. So I think mediators should also be in that same professional aspect. Um, I had another point something I was gonna share with you, and it just flew out of my head. I guess.
Yeah, I just put in the chat, Barbara, Houston has a great program. It's called HEART. That's like the acronym. And so they have a very good alternative response program. And yeah, so there are other places.
What with the police? Are you saying it's with the police?
It's alternative response. If you call 911,
Yes.
and
In
it's like
Houston?
and yeah, it's for mental health and behavioral health. I don't think they've incorporated mediation just, in the way that we envision it, but they do have alternative responders that come for mental health calls and behavioral health calls.
Well, that I know because we have people that have taken our mediation training that are intervention in that respect. But I think what you're also talking about is just anybody with a capacity, perhaps, of being able to reach out. But that's in the heart. That's interesting. I wrote an article, for the DeGuyer textbook on heart, being here, ear, and into the heart. But that's somebody's picked up on my acronym, but that's all right. I couldn't copyright it. I don't have one.
Great. Yeah, and there's some municipalities that are sort of more advanced than others in terms of having alternative response programs integrated with, sort of 911 and having law enforcement on board, and all that. But
do you have the contact information for the Houston group? I'd be very interested to connect with them.
I'll see. I don't have that, at the tip of my fingers, but I'm sure
I'll give you my email. Okay, thank you.
Oh yeah, Dobbs Ferry Food Pantry. There's the.
We've got a couple of minutes left. So if anybody has a final question, otherwise, Tracey, unless there's any final thought you want to share with us before we sign off for today.
No, I think I've talked enough. I just thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I think that there's lots of places that mediation can go that, we're probably not even thinking about right now. And I think that's exciting. Like you said, David, you think, sort of things get you down, but you think, there's some good things out there too. And I think sort of like what you all are doing here, raising money for food pantries is one of them. Absolutely.
Brilliant idea. Brilliant.
Yeah. And I think, thinking about, how mediation can help sort of bigger societal issues, I think it can.
It's a great way to leave us for today. Thank you so much, not only for being here today, for everything you do for the AAA, but also for your lifetime of commitment to mediation as well. And so I'm sure folks that can find you at the AAA if they have any other questions about the foundation or otherwise. We always encourage folks to, again, please let us know about any of the donations that you've been able to make today. Thank you to you again, Tracey, for your time and expertise. Thank you to our audience for being here. And with that, we are concluded.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tracey. In the chat, we received more than $2,800 in donations to food banks. So thank you so much for presenting today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. This was great. Thank you.
Yeah,